Hey guys, because Gaming here, welcome back to Wraithcast Season 2. This is basically just a podcast that was originally started by Furnace, who is one of our long-time guildies who isn't around anymore. But me being back on the YouTube scene, that I thought I might as well try and kick it off again. And I'm going to try and do this with a co-host, and that is Daki. Hello, Daki.
Hey Avatar, how you doing?
I am doing good, sir. So I think the point of the Wraithcast is to talk about certain events or certain subjects that have really gotten either my attention or Daki's attention, or just the talk about that's in the community at the moment. So that topic will be, has raiding got easier? Has raiding got harder? Sorry. So let's just try and answer this question in very briefly. Daki, has raiding got harder?
I don't think it's gotten harder per se. No, not really.
What makes you think?
When you look at the mechanics and you look at what's required of your tanks, your DPS, your healers in a boss encounter, generally speaking, if you rewound the clock back to previous expansions, how to look at what was required back then and then what's required now to get a boss kill or something similar, generally speaking, it's not significantly more difficult. There's alterations to each boss, but I wouldn't say that you're required to go 50% more than say 3 expansions ago, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, that's good input. I do have some certain subjects to talk about to sort of answer this question, and we'll both give our thoughts as the video goes on. So I think the general feel of the raids have changed. So lots of diversity of bosses, whether that be ones with very special mechanics, ones with very new mechanics, or ones that are either like more single target based or AoE based. What do you think? Let's compare, say, Castle Nathria and Sanctum of Domination. What do you think about the feel of those two raids that have been this expansion?
Yeah, 100%. Like, I think in particular, those two raids in particular, like if you have a look at Sanctum of Domination, it feels very, very single target orientated. With the exception of a couple of ones, like say Kel'Thuzad with the ads that are running around, Sylvanas has ads and things like that as well. But when you really boil down the fight, and if you were to have a look at every boss within Sanctum of Domination, and you had a look at what happens throughout that fight, generally speaking, and in most of the time, it's very single target orientated. And sure, you have differences in every single boss or different bosses as you go through, like Terragru is like just heavy DPS orientated, single target, burn it down sort of thing, versus the 9, which is a little bit more coordinated orientated, versus say Remnant, which is very healer intensive. There is differences there, but there's not like the boss doesn't disappear and then 4 waves of ads come out and you've got to deal with those and then the boss returns. Like Sylvanas does have that, but it's not the majority of the fight, if that makes sense.
No, and I think that's good because a raid with a lot of diversities, especially the long raids, like say Antorus, where it has a bit of everything, including a tower defense fight. It really makes the raid feel like a raid and not just like half of being single target, half of being AoE fest.
Well, again, if I was just to sort of touch base on that, if you look at Antorus versus say Castle Nathria, if you just took those two raids as an example, with Antorus, it felt like you were going through a narrative, like you felt like a story was being told as you were going through the raid. But with Castle Nathria and even Sanctum of Domination, even for that matter, I got to be honest here. Sanctum of Domination kind of feels like just a gigantic dungeon, mythic plus dungeon or something. You know what I mean? Like there's a boss down a corridor and you kill the boss, but there's not a huge narrative to tell. Versus Antorus. Antorus is like walking through a novel, if that makes sense.
Okay, yeah. Would you say you prefer those sort of raids?
100%. And I really hope that in 9.2, Blizzard really tell a story with the Sepulchre, I think it's called.
Yeah, especially the first ones.
Yeah, I really hope they tell a story, because when you have a look at the build up to going into a raid per se, like you have a look at what's happening, you're going through this story quest, you're going through, you know, all this build up, and then you're like, all right, we're at the gates of, you know, the Sanctum of Domination, we've got to go in there and we've got to stop the jailer and we've got to confront Sylvanas. And then you go in there and the story doesn't continue. It's basically like you walk through, Bolvar's like, all right guys, go that way, and then that's it. Like, there is a story when you read the dialogue and things, like, sure enough, but it doesn't feel like you're progressing in the story. You sort of get to the end of the raid and you're like, okay, cool, all right, done.
Or it doesn't feel like the story's finished.
It could do. I mean, and we are talking about this before 9.2, so maybe when 9.2 comes out and we look at that, we can go, okay, we understand a bit more. But currently, Antorus was like walking through a novel, but Sanctum of Domination feels more like a dungeon, like a big dungeon to me.
Okay, that's an interesting take on it. So I think with this expansion in particular, there have been probably more pure single target fights than there have been in any single expansion. So if you go into Castle Nathria, you'd find bosses like Shriekwing, Artificer, Hungering Destroyer, Sludgefist. They're all pure single target fights. It's just one boss. You're not focusing or related to any other adds, like a boss, say, Remnant of Ner'zhul, where there's just orbs that you have to kill. And going into Sanctum of Domination, there's bosses like Tarragu and Guardian of the first ones, and Painsmith. Actually, no, probably not Painsmith, but you get the idea. It's like there's a lot of pure single target fights now compared to back then. Do you think that's a good thing? A good approach for the raiding scene?
Yes and no. Done well. Like, don't get me wrong, Sanctum's a great raid overall. I would still rank it among one of the better raids that they've done. But if you have a whole raid of, how many bosses are in Sanctum? Like
10.
What? 10 bosses? If every single boss, except for say one or maybe 1.5 bosses, and this is where you got to get real with it, is if everyone is just, all right, next boss, what do we do? Stack, move 5 yards to the left. All right, stack again, cool. And move 5 yards to the left again. Oh, stack, oh, we got to dodge that puddle. Like, if you make every boss fight single target, you generally fall into that pit hole. You know, where if you look at old like, what was it, like Il'gynoth, if you look at Il'gynoth, when there's just ads upon ads upon ads, and then at the end, you've got to defeat this, you know, you finally defeat Il'gynoth sort of thing. That feels, you know, completely different to anything in Sanctum. You know what I mean?
Yeah, so it's like it starts off like the first 2 or 3 minutes of the fight is purely single target. Then after that, ads start rolling in. Like Kel'Thuzad, as we were discussing before we started, because it's just one boss. Maybe for like the first minute, it doesn't spawn any ads, but then after that, ads start slowly creeping in, and then the amount of ads that spawn increases the longer the fight goes on. So I think those are the sort of fights we're experiencing now. Which I think brings me to the next topic that I had, is that the completely brand new mechanics never seen before have been added in. So I've got a couple of examples here. One of them is the football boss on Dark Inquisitor Zanash near Lothar. I mean, this is going to be a bit controversial because I really don't like it, because one person fucks up, the whole raid is dead. I mean, the whole raid is dead. I don't know, I just don't really like those mechanics. On normal, it is a bit more forgiving. On normal, you can fuck up once and then still do it, but on heroic, you're just dead.
Yeah, when there's that much pressure placed onto one or two people's shoulders, and they could be doing the right thing, but maybe a tiny bit of RNG comes in, and then it's just, all right, guys, stop healing. It's a wipe sort of thing, you know?
Yeah. Or if you did it like me on Mage, which is terrible for that mechanic because Blink does not do shit. Does not help at all. And the other thing, actually in the same instance, is the image phase on the Prophet Skitra, where you're branded with one or two debuffs, and then each group of people can see one set of ads, and then the other group can see another set of ads. So you got to try and figure out which ad is overlapping the other ad, pretty much.
That was really fun to do, actually. That was frustrating a little bit at the beginning, but once people started understanding how that worked, it was actually really fun to get a handle of, actually.
Yeah, actually, I think that's kind of one of the better ones because it can just be cheese because your tanks are always in different groups, so they can just tell you which ad to kill, and that's the mechanic done. Well, for me, it is boring. It was more fun when the whole raid was trying to figure out what the ad was. But that's just me. And then I suppose if we look into, say, last expansion on Gahoon with the whole what do you call it? What do the people call it? The basketball mechanic, where you just take an orb from a spot and then you pass it to your teammate or whoever's on there, and then while trying to traverse through like a maze that's sort of slowing you down and such, and then dunking it into the goal or the console, I believe, or whatever it was in the raid. Was that a good mechanic?
In my opinion, yes. Once people started learning it, it became less of a chore, more of a fun iteration.
Yeah. And it definitely was fun for people who could solo it. Like Windwalker Monk. I played a Windwalker Monk for Gahoon, and I was able to solo the orb. Out of the 100 pulls that I did on my monk, I think I fucked it up 3 times. Whereas the other Windwalker Monk could not solo it for whatever reason.
And don't quote me on this. I think warriors and demon hunters could do it as well to a degree.
I knew warriors could. Warriors was a little bit more difficult to.
Because you needed someone to intervene to, right?
No, you just need to be precise with the charges.
Okay, yeah.
So you heroic leap 1, and then you use your 2 charges onto whatever the cis. I think they're called the cis, and then you were there. But it was quite easy to mess it up. Don't know about demon hunters though. I haven't tried it on a demon hunter.
But talking of new mechanics, like even the Jaina Proudmoore ability where she summons the big ring in front of her and then shoots like a big blast of ice in front of her. Like we've seen frontal cones before in boss fights, and frontal cones or cleaves are not a new thing. I mean, what's the old analogy? Don't stand behind a dragon. The tail does like a backwards cleave, if you so to speak. So frontal cleaves are not a new thing, but the way that they implemented it with Jaina, it felt new, even though fundamentally all it is it's a frontal cleave. But the way they did it felt like a new mechanic, and that was a good eye-opener.
Yeah, it definitely was, and especially if you fucked it up, he's sent flying off of the ship in some cases.
Mega yeet.
Doesn't really happen with a lot of those sort of knockback mechanics. Usually it might throw you off a platform, but not at a ship. So yeah, I do get where you're going with that. And then I guess over the course of the last few expansions, the class design has changed. So people may need to either relearn their class because it's changed dramatically, or they've had to re-roll because their class is so shit. Like in BFA was one of the expansions where it had the worst class design ever because they removed a lot of things, and then they added it all back kinda in Shadowlands, including some of all the old abilities like kill shot and certain shaman totems. What do you think about the class design, how it's impacted? Do you think it has made much of an impact?
Yes, but they need to find a balance, and that balance is very critical. So I think you're definitely correct in like BFA. The removal of too many abilities makes the gameplay slower. It also makes it a little bit easier, which is, sometimes okay, but in other cases can make it feel boring. And when you get all that loss of abilities, you start to wonder like, oh, I'm hitting the same two keys every single pull. It becomes boring. But then I have a feeling, and correct me if I'm wrong here, I have a feeling that Shadowlands may have overdone it a little bit, and I wonder if that is because of the covenants and things like that. Is we've got all of these buttons to press now. Is it maybe a little bit too much? Maybe do we just dial it back just a little bit? They need to find that balance, basically. But with class changes, like a good one is Survival Hunter. When Survival Hunter's gone from a ranged to a melee class, when was that? Legion, I think it was?
Yeah, it was Legion.
Yeah, like, I'm okay with a melee hunter, as much as some people are like, oh no, can't be done sort of thing. I'm okay with a melee hunter. I mean, at the moment, the class needs a little bit of work, but I mean, the spec needs a bit of work. But like, if the story tells that should happen, then I'm okay with it. I mean, have a think about past expansions, what's happened. I mean, Death Knights went from frost tanking to blood tanking, because fundamentally and lore-wise, it made a little bit more sense that Bloods was the tank and Frost was the DPS. And then you have a look at Druids getting a 4th spec, because fundamentally it made a bit more sense that tanks have their own spec and they have a DPS spec and rah. So when you talk about class change from one expansion to another, I think it's fine. I think that going from one expansion having 10,000 abilities to another expansion and you get that cut in half is still okay if you can find that balance. But if they remove all your abilities and you've only got 2 buttons, then that can become boring. You know what I mean? Like, it's just boring.
Yes. I think Beastmaster Hunters has always been like that. It's always just a 2-button rotation. Same with Fury Warriors.
Not so much anymore. Beastmaster actually, I found out that it's actually quite more than 2 buttons now. So I do apologize for all those Beastmasters out there, but no, solid, yeah, 100%. Don't make 2-button rotations, Blizzard. Just get rid of them. Just get rid of them.
Yeah, I like a class that has a lot of abilities, and I think the way you were going on about Survival Hunter, I think another famous one was the new the Pirate Rogue, the
Outlaw.
Yeah. Changed from combat to outlaw. I think the iteration that has been done now with the change to Roll the Bones, I think is probably the best version, because I've heard from some other outlaw rogues that in the past they've had to spam Roll the Bones a lot in order for them to get the decent buffs, which is kind of stupid. So they put a cooldown on it. So no matter what buffs you get, you're still gaining damage, if that sort of makes sense.
100%.
And then it's affected by the cooldown reduction by one of the passives that they have. I can't remember what it was called. I think it was Restless Blades or something. Which is good class design, and it made that spec far more different and unique to Sanation and Subtlety, because they were completely different. Not just because they use daggers, but their abilities feel far more different and far more suited to some sort of theme.
But it also fitted the expansion too. So
yes, it did.
Like, when they brought that out, it fitted BFA. Like, it was like, this actually fits with the theme. And whenever they do a class change, like let's say next expansion rolls out, if they do change classes, I really hope that Blizzard looks at the lore and the expansion that we're going into, and they sort of fit it with that expansion, because that would make any class design that they do or spec changes that they do feel a bit more welcoming. Like, there's no point in say elemental shamans and enhanced shamans getting rid of totems, but there's no reason behind why they got rid of totems.
Yeah.
But if they made a reason behind why they got rid of totems and rolled it into the story, it would be like, okay, we understand now. Like, that's,
But I think most of the time that doesn't happen, because there's always going to be someone that disagrees with everything.
Oh, yeah, you're not going to be able to please everyone. Yeah.
No. Which I suppose is fair. And I think while on that subject, the different iterations they've done to Shadow Priests of like Shadow Priests in Legion, where they're then very welcoming, because in the past or before Legion, Shadow Priests weren't really a thing. But when you look at a World First Guild and see they have stacking 5 Shadow Priests with Surrender to Madness, then that says something about the class, even when they're not running Surrender to Madness. And even now, they've sort of driven away from that sort of class design, because it was all about your Void form. Whereas now they've put Void form as one of your main cooldowns. And instead they brought back things like Devouring Plague, because Devouring Plague got removed right before Legion, and that did a ton of damage, and it still does now. So I was really happy to see the new Shadow Priest going into Shadowlands. But I suppose one of the more impactful things about the class is the borrowed power, which changes expect to expect, and sometimes even patch to patch. So I think in Legion is the case of the artifact weapons. So you got an artifact weapon when you start the expansion. It's going to stay with you until the next expansion, and then over the course of the expansion it's going to get more and more powerful, more and more crazy, which does allow, in some cases, does allow your class to feel more greater and be more fun. Like, I don't know, as an example, I think the Boomy was quite fun with the artifact weapons. Same with sort of arms warriors, but those are the sort of mains I played back then. I don't know, Jackie, how did Death Knight or whatever main you were maining in Legion, how did that feel with versus without the artifact weapon?
The Legion artifact weapons in particular, so I was still, was it Unholy and Blood, basically. The pros with borrowed power in that form is it grows in strength over the course of the expansion, or like you said, from patch to patch. So the pro is the player feels like they're contributing or growing in strength, basically. So the only other thing that we've got in the game this is when you maxed out, basically. The only other thing in the game that makes us feel stronger and stronger is gear. But you reach a limit with gear, either with item level or with just the ability to gain that gear. So you reach a hard cap point. But then when Blizzard releases a new, patch, your artifact weapons, your legendaries, anything like that, it grows in strength, or you have the ability to gain strength, which is why it's called borrowed power, obviously. So the pros, and it felt really good for me, is that it made me feel stronger and stronger and stronger as the expansion went on. 100%.
And did it make your class more fun to play now that you've got these sort of power buffs?
Initially, yes. I mean, off the start, like when you went and got your artifact weapon and you're like, oh, sweet, I got my hands on this really juicy new weapon that's, and it's got this story tied to it, and I'm going to go and do devastating things. And then, yeah, initially it did. But I mean, if I looked back and had a look at the end of the expansion, not really. Not at the end. It didn't feel... I wonder if it's because it didn't feel new or exciting. But at the beginning, yeah, it felt really cool to have this weapon, and oh shit, I've got talent points to put into it, and I get this new awesome ability because it's a new weapon, and yeah, in a way it did.
Yeah, and it had lots of little passives as well, which made some of your abilities made it feel more fun and made it feel more powerful. I can't remember what they were for Unholy Death Knight, but they had the Apocalypse as the ability, so it's like a mini sort of Army of the Dead on a
mini Army
lower
of the Dead,
cooldown,
yeah.
Which felt really cool.
But what about you? Did it feel exciting when in Legion?
Well, I was switching mains all the time in Legion, so I'm gonna go with my original one. Was actually the Prot Warrior. I think I played the most of. The Prot Warrior didn't really feel anything excited because it's a tank, so most of its abilities is based upon your survival and such. But I think if I go to something like the Warlock, so like say the Affliction Warlock, where you've got a trait where whenever you kill something, it does AoE damage to everything around it. That did feel very, very fun in Mythic Plus, or like raid encounters that had lots of ads, like ENR. So it made you feel like that your class could actually do really good damage. Or say, similarly, the Destruction Warlock, where you had your 3 sort of portal rifts as your ability. But I think one of the changes was, or later on in the expansion, they made it so there's a chance that a red portal would spawn, and that will do even more damage, which did feel, I don't know if it made me feel more powerful, but it did change up the playstyle for me a little bit, and I was more welcoming to that sort of change. I can't remember off the top of my head any weapons that really stood out. Trying to think, because Frost Death Knight had pretty good artifact traits, because the Frost Death Knight's the Blade of the Fallen Prince was originally one of the ones that didn't have an ability. Once you got it, you had to unlock it. So it was the Syndragos' Fury, which is breathe an entire frost room across the room, which was really, really, really cool.
Very unique.
Yeah, very unique, and it feels right for that class. It feels right for a Frost Death Knight to summon a Frost Worm, compared to, say, an Unholy Death Knight. They're somewhat of ghoul-based sort of thing. Same with, I think it was the Holy Priest, although that's a healing one, so I can't really say much about that.
It was fun.
Yeah. But I think Borrowed Power, it always has its good and bads, like in terms of how do you unlock it, how do you make it more powerful. Like, let's say the most recent addition to Borrowed Power, Shards of Domination. Getting them is a big pain in the ass, and upgrading them is even worse, because you just got to constantly farm the raid to chase it feels very minor, very, very minor compared to something like, say, Corruptions, where you're just doing your normal content, farming for specific corruptions, or if you're farming later on in the expansion, what was it called? Echoes of Neolotha. So you could buy certain corruptions and put it on whatever piece you want. So if you put enough dedication to it, then you would have had or in my case, a Destruction Warlock with half Ineffable Truth and half Expedient, which made the class significantly more fun and changed it entirely. So I think Corruptions really did have its place. Shards of Domination don't really have its place. I mean, it's very, very mediocre. I don't know, what do you think about Shards of Domination?
So like the problem with shards is that it's very raid specific. So
Yeah.
if you're a player that doesn't raid, or if you just do normal just to be like, hey, cool, I've been through the raid and that's all I'm going to do for the expansion, then Shards of Domination is useless to you.
Yeah.
Because ultimately, even the benefit that you would see from it being in the maw is not, it's not drastic. It's not a huge amount. But where it really comes into its own right is how much benefit it gives you in heroic or mythic raiding. That's where you're going to see the difference. The problem with Shards of Domination, or the shard gear, basically, I should say, is they tried to hit tier sets, but they missed. And I think that's what they're rectifying in the next patch with bringing back tier sets, which is what everyone was saying, like, just bring back tier sets. Tier sets can be taken to a dungeon. Tier sets can be taken to PvP. Tier sets can be taken to your world quest. Tier sets can be taken to your little camping spot in Stormwind while you wait for a dungeon to pop. Tier sets are useful where Shards of Domination is only moderately, if very minimally useful in most accounts. I think the biggest problem with Borrowed Power is it deludes the character, it deludes the class, or the spec, basically. If you have tier sets, in most cases, tier sets are like proc X amount of armor when you get critically hit or something. I'm just using an example, right? In 9.2, the tier sets are a little bit different. They actually do different things, but in most cases, it's just it's there, it's passive, you don't have to interact with it. So the borrowed power in that sense is, yeah, it's fine. But the borrowed power in the sense of, let's say, what was it, the Azeroth, the neck piece in the last expansion,
Oh, yeah.
that's a little like it dilutes the character a bit too much. Yeah, corruption's another example. Corruption, like, we had people at the end of the expansion with stupid amounts of corruption, and your class felt very, like, your class on its own felt very insignificant because the corruption was doing all of the damage or
Yeah, pretty
all of the
much.
healing, again, it's about balance. I mean, bringing back tier sets, I think, is a fantastic idea. Shards, I honestly don't really care too much about shards, like the shard gear, the domination gear, I should say. That's my personal opinion.
Yeah, and I think with Pro Power, there's always something that's going to need to be nerfed or something that's going to need to be buffed. Like Echoing Void, the first week it was out, it was doing crazy damage. I mean, World First Raiders had cloth pieces on their tanks just so they could have the right amount of corruption to get themselves through the instance. Which 100%. Was which was funny to hear about. Whereas something like as you're saying, Shards of Domination, you can only use it in the raid, so you can't A, farm it by doing dungeons, and B, you can't even use it at dungeons because it's limited to the zones, which I think lore-wise it does seem realistic, but gameplay-wise it just feels terrible. If your borrowed power is limited based on your location.
Well, the reason why borrowed power in tier set form is better than, say, corruption or Shards of Domination and things like that is, imagine being in a dungeon with someone that's the exact same class and spec as you. So let's say, rewind time back to when corruption was a thing, right? So imagine if you were on a subtlety rogue, I'm on a subtlety rogue, but I have perfect corruption, but you don't. It feels very, like, you feel very insignificant because of that borrowed power.
Yeah.
And don't get me wrong, people are going to be like, well, tier sets will do the same thing, and yes, they will, but it's not to the same degree. So yeah, that's just my opinion. But also, tier sets are going to, like, here's the other problem. Tier sets will encourage more people to go and raid, where domination gear doesn't fully encourage it. Like, you don't hear people like, yay, I'm going to go in normal raid or heroic raid for domination gear just so I can raid better. Where if you get tier set, people are like, well, let's go and raid the Sepulchre because I want the tier set to do my world quest better or to do my Mythic Plus better. So you encourage people to go and do that sort of content.
Yeah, and I think Essence has really encouraged people to do it. But if you start adding some set of restrictions like Shards of Domination, then no one's going to really go out of their way. But if you're trying to min-max everything, especially when it comes to raiding, then I suppose it does all add up if you've got it all maxed. Like, all my gems aren't even maxed. But I think the good thing about the one redeeming quality about Domination Shards is that when you're in a place where it can't activate the bonus, you can then, because you're forced to have 3 of the same color of gem, when you're on Mythic Plus or just out doing raw content, you can use shards of other colors. So like you can use the 3 damage ones all with a different color. It's like the purple damage one, the red damage one, and the blue damage one, which does seem fun, even though the effects on them are still pretty laughable. It does allow that to be an option, if that sort of makes sense. Anyway, I think we've had enough about biopower. Let's get back to the raiding scene. So I think back then, especially in Legion, the fights were a bit more straightforward. It didn't have very complex mechanics like doing the football on Xanash, doing the rings on Riccarlo. So yeah, what do you think? What do you think of the really difficult, or where do you think the real difficulty lies right now, and then where the difficulty lies in either BFA or Legion?
That's a good question, because I think fundamentally, if you looked at the Dungeon Journal and you went through the abilities of, say, Legion, BFA, and Shadowlands as an example, just those 3 expansions, and you had a look at just a random boss fight in any of those expansions, and then you had a look at any boss fight in Shadowlands, fundamentally, you probably wouldn't see any more or less abilities than their counterpart in a previous expansion. So what I mean by that is, like, if you picked a random boss in Legion and a random boss in Shadowlands, you had to look at their abilities they do within the fight. Fundamentally, they were about the same. Where the difference lies, though, and where I think people, well, not that they're caught up or anything, but where I think the difficulty lies in this expansion is the way that those abilities come into the fight. So Ner'zhul, Remnant and Ner'zhul is a great example of this. If you have a look at Remnant and Ner'zhul, realistically, he's only got like 3 abilities. And when you look at what's required of the raid, it's actually not that much. But where the difficulty of Ner'zhul comes into it is the change in the timers. So when those abilities come in, so the more damage you do, the less you get of a certain mechanic, because the timer gets pushed out. Where if you did less damage, you would incur more of a certain ability. That's where the challenge, I think, lies. And I think that goes throughout the whole theme of Sanctum of Domination, because another example is the 9. If you looked at the abilities the 9 do, there's only 2 abilities each of those bosses do, realistically. But it's how those abilities come into the fight is where the challenge where the challenge lies. And I think that's where people can get caught up, essentially. Fundamentally, no. On their own and on paper, every boss is not more challenging, but when they implement it into the game, it's how those abilities are brought into each fight, I think is where the challenge is. Yeah.
So you're talking about like how overlaps will affect the fights. So you're saying how the abilities come in, like if, say, Signe, which is one of the 9s, if she's doing an ability, and then one of the other abilities that comes from like the other 6 Valkyrie in the fight, how would that affect the raid if both of those came at the same time, sort of thing? Is that what you mean?
Correct. So, as an example, if you looked at the 9 fight, basically, let's have a look at just a point in time of that fight, just a random point in time. Let's say you had all 3 bosses came down. You were doing a transition between the 2 first bosses and the third one that came down. So let's say you get a fragment on you, right, where you've got to go and stack and be dispelled. Let's say you were running out with a fragment, and then there was you also got the stack. Like, it's fundamentally near impossible for that to happen, but let's say it did. So let's say you had the group stack and the fragment on you, as well as the blades going throughout the raid, as well as any splash damage, or you can see how it can add up, and all of that's overlapped basically. So yes, it can get very hectic, and I think that's where the difficulty lies. If you broke it down, you have a look at each one of those abilities. Fragments, okay, I need to run and stack. That's not a difficult thing to do. I've got the big stack circle on me. That's not how I just stand with my friends. Or the blades are coming through the room. Let me just move 1 yard to the left or right. So individually, each one of those abilities is very easy. There's harder abilities out in the world quests, Yeah. But when you start putting them into a boss fight and each one of those abilities starts overlapping, that's where your difficulty is.
Yeah, exactly. And I think there are some certain bosses in the past that are all about overlaps. Like in the commentary videos I've been doing, I've been talking about certain overlap points. Like on Painsmith Rasnal, you're going to get to a point where you're going to he's going to go into the second intermission, but you're usually going to phase him right after he's thrown a weapon at the tank. So you've got the spikes coming in from towards the boss, and you've also got spikes coming towards the tank from the weapon. So it's not difficult. It's not impossible to dodge by any means, but it does change it up a bit. You're getting to really open your eyes and see where certain safe spots are, sort of thing. And I think I'm sure there are other overlap bosses. I'm just trying to think of perfect examples. I'd say maybe Coven of Shivara from Antorus. You might have had, like, say, Storm of Darkness. This is on Heroic anyway. Storm of Darkness and, say, one of the Torment of the Titans, or whatever it's called. Maybe it's, say, the Kasgaroth one. So you're standing in safe zones while also trying to avoid fire lines, or not really avoid fire lines, but stand in a place where you're not going to get hit by fire lines. On paper, it does seem difficult. In theory, it was kind of difficult, but it is still not impossible. So that's that does add a difficulty in those type of fights. But they're not all the fights. They're not always about overlaps. It's just can you deal with certain mechanics correctly, or can you use your abilities, use your defensive abilities more often so you can survive, because there are some very raid heavy damage sort of thing. Like the boss does a lot of damage over the course of the entire fight, like Painsmith. Painsmith does a lot of damage, especially towards the last 40% of the boss. That's when damage really starts to ramp up, because you're getting ticked for constant damage until the boss dies. You've got weapons that are thrown onto the raid. On Heroic, you've got the traps that need to be blown up, and then I think just the damage from the spikes that come up as well, and chained people also take damage. So I think those sort of fights are just all about making sure that you survive. More of a case than healers need to heal a lot more, or healers need to pay attention a bit more than they have compared to others, sort of thing. So I think in my sense, I think raiding has gotten harder because the raids have changed a lot more. So they always try new things, which is great. I mean, don't get me wrong. As long as they don't use mechanics like the football boss ever again, I'm okay with it. Because at least they tried to do something.
Yeah, I mean, it was fun.
Yeah, and same with the Gahoon mechanic. Although it wasn't absolutely horrible, but it wasn't the best mechanic to perform, because you're going to have some people that are going to struggle with those mechanics. I think a famous example for me is in BOD, when I was raiding with my American guys on Mechatalk. We had this new sort of trial come in. He did okay damage, but he absolutely sucked at calling out the colours. Like, he just wouldn't do it. Like, people would call his colours and then just hop out to leave the other person to die, which was usually me. So I think he failed to call the colours once. I died. Next pull after that, someone else failed to call my colours. I also died. And then that same person, the first time, failed to call my colours again. And then I just logged off. I was so filled with rage. It's crazy. But you do get, or talking more fair circumstances, where we had in our raids in Wraith, we had someone who was colorblind, so it was more difficult for him to call out the colors, which is fair. And I think he knew which colors were which is very impressive. So stuff like that can be resolved with some sort of ways, either by just like researching or just paying more attention to mechanics. And it does depend on the mechanic as well, because I'm absolutely shit when it comes to the rings on Fat Scrub Ricardo. That's why I rate him the worst boss of Sanctum of Domination by a long shot, because that ring mechanic is just so frustrating for me. What about you, Jackie? Has raiding got harder?
At its core, not a lot, but they've definitely thrown some curveballs. They've thrown some curveballs at, with new mechanics. They've thrown curveballs at, how the timers and everything roll in. But fundamentally, no. If you break the fights down and you know what you're doing, then no, it's not drastically harder. I think, but in saying that, I guess there's two things I'd like to say. Like, one is we've had a little bit more wipes on these bosses we've had in this expansion versus past expansions, granted.
Yeah.
But if you have a look at, say, the Mythic Plus races and things like that, they haven't, like, they're still defeating the raids within like a few days to a week. So if the raids were getting significantly harder or fundamentally harder, they would be taking weeks, if not months, to get those, bosses down or the raid down. But they're not. They're getting them down within a few days to a week. They're actually getting quicker. So I don't think I don't think it's drastically harder. No, it's different, but it's not harder per se.
Okay. And I think a lot of people nowadays are sort of relying on weak auras. I've never used a single weak aura ever playing this game. I didn't use the Fate Scriber Color weak aura. I didn't use Shadowlord Iskall weak aura or anything like that, because I don't feel like I need them. And it sort of makes you a better player thinking that you don't need them, which you don't, but people need it to sort of improve their play, or if they are having trouble seeing something, or whatever the case might be. But I think that's all we've got to talk about on this Wraithcast. So thank you guys for joining. Thank you, Daki, for coming into the conversation.
Thank you, man.
Looking forward to doing more in the future. I'm going to try and see if I can get additional guests to come on to talk about other sort of subjects or things in WoW. But yeah, we'll leave it there, and we'll leave the next video for a little bit later, because we are getting into the Christmas period, so things start getting a little more busy, I suppose. I had a saying for it, I just can't remember what it was. So anyway, this has been my co-host Gaming and Daki. Link to his channel in the description. So thank you guys for watching. I'll see you next time. Bye bye.